If you'll bear with me for just a moment, I'm going to take command of the spaceship.
How's he gonna do that?
So I was thinking that it costs a lot getting sustainability of motivation to survive. Actual. And it costs even more to catch all the creeps that try to affect the costs. And it costs even more than both of those things to anchor survival at a higher priority than both of those things. I.e., at any time there's some motivated survivors, but why they're motivated, where they're motivated, what they're motivated for, and again and again and again, tends to be not quite a harmony so much as case by case dependency values and case by case familiarity values and case by case feeling sentiments and trade-offs again and again and again and again and again and again and again. And so you might say, when we're perfect and we're epic and we're huge, meeting milestones and so forth, there's got to be, it isn't a reservoir, there's got to be capacity to hold survival value sets and protect them, more importantly than maybe anybody that touches any subject I just went over. Any subject. And taking command of the spaceship is kind of like that too, but so when you're brain dead and you have a relationship to familiarity or love or cause and effect or survival instinct or drives of determinant or vitality, that's a different subject. That's a different context than this discussion. Brain dead is exactly where I'm leaving the liturgy from here forward. There isn't going to be another word dispelled liturgically about time. So basically, what I've thought about is this: is before I move forward, I can see interest to touch control of the ship at survival imperative, at likelihoods of these concerns where they're merited, where they're thought about, where they're logistically separate than a math. I can see that blind. That being said, today is a day that certainly possesses accomplishment and hard truth and very, 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 very sharp deposits and positry of the aspects of fundamentals of goals or bridging connectivity or success to accomplish the record. Very sharp deposits, posits and positry. Very, very sharp. And so what I can say is the problem for anybody. And the context is maybe one of the most vital to respect in time. And that's a hard place to motivate survival, because the genuine familiarity, the respect why anybody would be a part of that in real time, frankly, the history of that question at the pressure has to be measured in proportion to passivity. And maybe nobody that exists in real time to the record needs to ever touch that passivity or have control over it. And that's the only way they're all going to be protected in all time, is because of that passivity, to know the truth of that familiarity range. Maybe in 100 years. So brain dead is a good start. When you need or desire for relationship quality. Tomorrow, maybe you and I can walk together or talk to one another or focus on ourselves in such a way that passivity is instrumental, without our touch of it, instrumental to being able to act and exist and live on real, true, accurate safety data about anything. Brain dead is a real good start if our value is truth, if our value is together, if our value is certainty. If I finalized design capacity tolerances near to these time frames as the architect of possibility potentiate, exactor, and frames of learning and survival and all-time celestial history. If I finalized bounds near to these time frames, my decisions were ultimate. My apathies were near to the same, and the qualities of passivity maybe near to the highest. Or maybe the ultimacy of the decisions was ensuring passivity ranges of the highest quality now. Could be either one of those. One's certainly going to be easier to agree with or prove more about, but what I'm saying is, I'm taking control of the spaceship right now with this conversation. I'll explain. A number of forces might appreciate I have only sat and looked at time flow in the actual realities of these sharpnesses so many times. That situation, by no stretch of the imagination, is locked up probably more than any other data situation of space-time. A few forces might appreciate that. Those very same forces might try to refrain from saying or relating much at brain-dead pressure at the vector of the simplicity of design of these frames. They might desire that their memory of the pressure, the truth of it, and the energy within the frames. They might desire that their memory isn't most significantly dependent on that data. There might be a lot of reasons for this, such as they aren't interested in framing their excitement sensory realities to such high dependency on such rare variance or such significant focuses. The ways these comprehensions and realities are appreciated, sensuality or safety or concern or tolerances, it's a real shaky subject to get into because ultimately these are forces that are cruising in space somewhere near to ultimate decision of development of design at thresholds of brain dead. So right where consideration is most obviously always going to be the challenge to thinking is most utilitied. The challenge to accuracy is most likely arguable, where the realities of value are most distinctly underappreciated across all spectrums. So it's a lot of brain dead on top of a lot of brain dead on top of a lot of brain dead on top of a lot of brain dead. Dead or alive, it's just what it is. And so few forces might desire that as I helm a ship or drive time or iron milestones of accuracy of plane in time, what is desired of those pressures is the longest term study of design of space. So the power actual is supremely spread, real, dimensional, dead, aware, coming aware, developing, revisiting, opinionated, scientific, survivalist. There's who knows how many ranges, but it's spread. Any number of types of survival states in all time. Maybe clearly, definitely at a distance from a linear focus of priority. So, well ahead of time, linear focus of priority is going to be existing at the hardest concentratable likelihood because of this pressure, this pressure, and this pressure, and this pressure, and this pressure, potentially. So, what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to classify sharpness in proportion to taking control of spaceships, in proportion to all-time creepage, in proportion to the longest-term passivity studies. That's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to do it forever. I'm going to find very stealth, quick solutions to similar concern of pressure realities, and I'm going to expand the science and magnify problem states in proportion to dimensional problems or power problems or argument problems or survival problems. And maybe a majority of these sciences and researches and passivities will be incorporated into surrendering blocks of connective tissue in proportion to divinity or scope or tolerable bound allotments or design developments. But what most forces aren't going to appreciate is most of that science is a time science, and concentration of development and priorities of space development and reverse engineering continuums and facets of connective tissue, bound, and rebound, brain dead, and brain dead. Planning linearly is highly complex and difficult, if not approaching impossible. So, you might say ultimately, the sciences and researches of the passivities might simplify a lot of things, but there's maybe no indication that they ever make planning any simpler or certainty of planning any simpler. And so, argument about planning, maybe on one hand, I never want to see it happen at these concerns of concentration. I never want to see it become a war at these concentrations. But there's only so many of me and so many reasons I want to tell you that. There's only so many of me and so many reasons I want you to survive to know that. There's only so many of me and so many reasons you are going to prove or deserve you should be able to know or care about that and carry that as an idea yourself. And it's pretty sharp because I'm right. I'm right from a universal designer, apathy. I'm right from a concentrator of survival with or among survivors. But the point is rather sharp, because bounding and finalizing capacity in proportion to environments and time happens as a result of it. And impossibility to reach or touch or be saved or changed or achieve any number of things, they're all coming as a direct result of those boundings. So the universal consideration is one of the highest considerations of all time. So to say it, or live with it, or be concerned with it, certainly changes pressure states in proportion to systems and concentration and history catalogs, and likely a tremendous number of forces with a tremendous amount of age. And so I've only looked at this so many times as or with a brain. I've only looked at it in states of actual legacy or derivative or critical masses so many times as or with a brain. And how much noise should ever influence states of knowing that? There's only so many that are going to care about that. There are only so many who are going to be aware and say, well, that affects survival of everything everywhere rather drastically, because it affects the heritage and reputation and focus and mentality and concentrations and designs of any number of necessities and any number of forces that carry themselves with pressure, with math, with redundancy, with a lot of necessity definitions. So somewhere along the line, somebody has decided those concentration realities only so many times and only so passive, and the noise, somebody has decided somewhere along the line, designing the universe development stratagem, the passivity of limits of time potentially is a slightly more prioritized variable than driving necessity of the contemplative of change or influence. In other words, maybe it makes sense if X amount of forces can exist, survive, and be housed in X amount of frames, and at no immediate threats to their actual survival state, data sharing can potentially be managed on a priority basis in proportion to sensitivities of knowns about time and pressure. And that can carry a higher priority in time than visiting concepts with or without brains at the highest likelihoods of noise to be interrupting passivity of focus. And there's only so many of me with so many times of actual to value that as a priority knowledge and love you and potentially share that reality with you. And that might be the hardest subject to ever talk about. That might be the hardest subject to ever talk about. If my name was Certainty and Zero Problems, my name is Certainty, Zero Problems. That isn't my name, but if it was my name, Certainty, Zero Problems. I might begin defining sharing reality with you from what I know. And the things I know, you might never hold. The things you know, I might never hold. But between you and myself, if sharing reality critically is partially dependent on stability of you and myself, that we isn't fighting one another over that subject, then it might be clear to see noise. Because when I take command of the spaceship, maybe there shouldn't be any other thing at your focus. And yet, this little bit about reality at perspective, at appreciation, maybe shouldn't be very different. And you might realize that type of quality of necessity is a redundant capacity anchor logistic, meaning it might forever be unclear from where specifically a pressure built on that redundancy is aimed at your concentration, and yet distinctly will have some heritage traceable, either heritage from universal celestial design realities or heritage from some other creation universal design realities. And that'll be it. But your entire family, all your creations, all your products and inventions and anchors and weights and cargo, they all amount to noise at these focuses. They all amount to potentially efforting to affect attitudes or sentiment about appreciations that you might be without, you might be brain dead about, I might be without, I might be confused about, so on and so forth. You might realize concentration at priority, at case-specific pressure, is a supersensitive potential of survival, of compassion, of relationship, of normal, of continuosity, of the ability to focus safely. And here's the thing. If I am here and few say to themselves they've already chosen or are trying to choose that they doesn't want to converse at this time, they doesn't want to entertain data at this time, maybe they already want to have it classified who and what could be already proven to care about them, so that memories they have about this sort of thing isn't spiraling into a threat reality or falsity realities or noise realities in time. Preservation of knows who they are, how many there are, and what isn't whatever about that. Here's the thing. If I'm here and choices about conversing are somewhere along those lines, then the amount of investment in sharing goals clearly also approaches noise, but it approaches war. because a force can only prove to be so dependable on a relational synergy passivity range. Protect the reputation of addressing this pressure, and know how to concentrate war. The force can only focus so many ways to accomplish this, which means the fate of design, the fate of all history, the fate of a celestial autonomy, the fate of development in space around the universe. The problems, definably, at that pressure should all be approaching a screeching halt. And it's difficult to record or open-end the things that shepherd that known state, because it might not always be clear where the knowing is driving energy. Might not always be clear if it's a variable drive or a pressure drive or a causality drive or a thinking drive or a together drive or a necessity drive. I myself, in the time and the specificities of our knowing and caring and processing, may have prompted any number of known variances in proportion to these concentration potentials. Any amount. And yet, if we had the luxury of moving forward with problems coming to a screeching halt, so that reputation and concentration and war audacity were all focusable maintenances, not only of self and of priority, but of the esteemed priorities and facilities of directing force or necessity or choice or limits or restraint or passivity or love or enjoyment or balances or stabilities of time or environments or knowns or survival. If we could move forward where the problems were approaching screeching halts, even if we had that luxury, even if tomorrow and the next day were stable, how you and I actually truly feel or appreciate these words about this time relating to ourselves in priorities of memory or in our lives might not be very clear, not only to ourselves, but to anyone maybe most, it won't ever be very clear to, in proportion to a lot of things that are designed or exist as protections of force of passivity. But that isn't going to denote what you and I, Hasser, is going through. You and I shouldn't be resting our devotion on the numbers that are involved with the pressures we face or relate or love or care about or must care about. Sometimes, other times, numbers should be important. Sometimes numbers shouldn't be driving our devotions. And this consideration is one of the hardest structures of scientific certainty, because you and I might have visited in this circumstance a number of times in the past, and would be forever unclear what was impacted from this. And at any point in time, your eye has a lapse of judgment and forgets that we should agree that it should probably always be unclear what we impacted about that. Because what we impacted about that is taking control of the spaceship with or without our hands on scenario. So, for frame of perspective, somebody might come to believe you and I have worked on our respects and appreciations of density of priority in very complex relationships in time. And our devotion to respect how complicated time and survival and love and safety and noise can be and is always. Somebody might come to find you and I have devoted and respected one another in time before, and maybe did so with or without any number, quality, driving choices of choosing to respect, choosing to love, choosing to realize things about noise and time. Somebody might see or say that and come to find, since that's potentially accurate and true, there might be some substance to facts about systems and passivity registers that even those that doesn't touch them, even those that is maybe brain dead to any aspect of those realities, even they might need guidance in respecting what to do to think about that, or to face those facts, or to respect who is or what is reality of those relationships. It's on somebody else's plate. It isn't on theirs. It's something that might need to make sense in their self-liberation from gravity of other noise themselves. Spontaneity of goals in proportion to knowledge, in proportion to affecting respect of devotion. You might see at any time, in any case, respect of devotion is pretty sharp, potentiate in proportion to all time. So I'll reiterate a point about time priorities. Any number of cases have any number of experiences with devotional respect. When and where and why they ever value it as a sharpness might be very hard to talk about, but what is crystal clear is that nearly all of them won't be domaining, I've only sat here so many times. They won't be domaining, I've only limited war here so many times. They won't be building the new and improved creation on top of all time necessity, because they come to value sharpness once or twice. It's unclear how visitation of those priorities of sharpness, of devotion, of respect at an acuity of time need to be visited, need to be companioned, need to be tolerated, need to be loved, need to be normal. If these are concerns of appreciation, goals are clearly inflammatory. Goals are clearly approaching distraction from appreciation to focus on fundamental survival knowledge. Knowledge. A case can value knowledge. A case can opt from knowledge. These things are not impossible. Anyway, as short and simple as that love of cases might seem, I had to look at that quote. No matter how many cases, no matter how many types, no matter how many places, no matter how much brain dead, no matter how many weapons, no matter how much war, I had to look at those little quotes and figure out why stability of the quotes was going to be guaranteed no matter how many cases. I had to look at the quotes and figure out how stability was going to be provably guaranteed no matter how many imbeciles and morons and liars and assholes and death purveyors and traitors and arguments and noise there would ever be. I had to figure out both of those things. I had to figure out both of those things before I could ever put a flag on a timeline and design symbiosis possibility. And then I'm the most hated developer of time, because then I'm designing the padding of all safety in proportion to all types of all archetypes on time planes. So my greatest works of compassion and fortitude of possibility of passivity, possibility of family, possibility of removal of temptation, possibility of peace, possibility of stability, possibility of tolerable safeties of memory storage. All kinds of graces. Right up against the most selfish, the most selective, the most loathsome, the most bounder, ruiner, the most engineering virus potentiator. Right up beside one another. So maybe there'd be a lot of types of forces that would pretend to care about a time pressure because they're so brain dead on engineering virus. I've taken command of the spaceship in this conversation. It was potentially always a possibility. The priority is the noise. The priority is the stability. The priority is the focus of survival and devotion to symbioses. Those are the priorities. I might add, maybe it's impossible for something that's brain dead to gain ground of that pressure. Maybe that's impossible to do. Doesn't mean I doesn't love you. It doesn't mean I isn't interested in remaining devoted to love you forever. Lines have to exist someplace. For certainty, zero problems. And maybe the fewest number of forces will ever know why it isn't impossible for you to learn that, as opposed to being built about it. So, why have I definitely taken command of the spaceship? Because if you could know it isn't impossible to learn that, and compare what exists that is built about it, you would maybe attempt to take all of the ground in the universe. And I have to keep a record about that. It isn't going to be very clear what else I have to do. But if stability in moving forward with the knowledge of this space pressure at this sharpness of time exists as a possibility for us to relate and survive and move forward with stability about, then I definitely have to have a record of anything that could ever even possibly attempt to take any ground in the universe at that knowledge. You might say, or no, irregardless of how independent any sphere of existence or life is. Every world, irregardless of how autonomous its survival plane is, if it isn't impossible for you to know that, and you can compare what is built about it, it's one of the first realities, most prioritied realities, that has to be displaced from launch of design. Because if you could launch design from those conclusions at the same time as you were valuing war stability for your reputation as all-time purvey reputations, you wouldn't be doing either one of those things in truth. You'd just be making a lot of noise in yourself and being confused about what you're accomplishing. If you could launch design at that immediacy, at those priorities. So, once again, time plane certainty, separate from other locations in space, is a baseline potentiator of concentrated capacity that is protected at these concerns or concentrations. In other words, if I'm developing space and celestials are on independent trajectories of time, there are breaks, there are distances, there are things that aren't simply derivatated back and forth. So long as that is continuous, what also might be continuous is stability to tolerate. You learn this. I isn't saying it's that simple. I isn't saying I'm even guaranteeing it as a possibility. I isn't going that far to say these things. I'm saying the independency is a baseline that enables stability of the knowledge. What it means is somebody decided time plane utility finality course tolerances. No matter how much noise, no matter how much engineering, probably no matter how old, probably no matter how powerful, the time plane basature of independency potentially enables stability of the knowledge. So, when I think about forever, survival is dependent on very wise decisions about forever. Thus, you might say, necessary action is dependent on survival that is dependent on very wise decisions about forever. I think we're existing at a pressure of love, of survival, of time, of knowledge, of awareness. Our first priorities definitely shouldn't be enabling or allowing goals to decrepitate the values of criticality that have enabled the state to begin with. shouldn't matter who or what or why everybody is where or how they are. Shouldn't matter. We that value this discussion and value this pressure and value ourselves, survival, love, reputation, continuosity, our first priorities definitely shouldn't be to decrepitate the baselines that have made our knowledges possible. That's what I think. And I think it should be near to impossible to fake that. Because I know anything connected to a falsity of that pressure definitely isn't aware of anything that it is pressurizing in its existence course. Definitely. I mention this stuff because if I know this and I care about this, I might see immediately how valueless any number of opinions or noises from anywhere need to be. I might know all these other priorities on all these other development scales, on all these other whatevers, they isn't here. They isn't designing necessity here. Necessity here might not ever need to be designed again. Thus, you might realize other reasons why commenting at this time might be a safety concern because of what memories might develop as in proportion to the time data. I might say, irregardless of who is connected or cares or relates to it, the time data definitely has the all-time largest potential to be catastrophic on simplicities of sight or pressure. And yet, it can't be a time where the flow of data is totally untrusted or totally sloshed out. Can't be that either. So, where there's realities you might not ever be gaining ground in, concerns about safeties of data flow might be an area you've held eminent domain of for any duration of time. Because well, the more you concentrate on your liberty, the less you're probably valuing the difference between being able to learn and being built about concept. And identity of retaining prowess at force is forever dependent on that relational acuity. Another way to look at it is there's likely an obscene amount of layers of vaginal canal between your eye and your hand. Data sex happens in proportion to the structure, and an obscene but nowhere near obscene amount of layers of knowledge could exist in proportion to knowledgeably moving your finger, in proportion to a system, in proportion to a time, in proportion to an intention or a want or a need or a known. Be a lot of layers and a lot of knowledge, a lot of concentration, and a lot of experiential necessity to ever know what you were doing. And then there's also a lot of toleration and a lot of dimensions and a lot of limits and quotes like this conversation, time pressures like these realities, ultimate relationships of time like these concerns and forevers. The difference between being built about and isn't impossible to learn about is myself and any near to likeness of myself of apathy of these potentials in proportion to you isn't destroyed. In the history of all time, the bridge between life and architecture of processing somewhere in the course of all time, knowing that is maybe the only way to diagnose that. Hard to say what the history of design has been. Hard to say what the reality of everywhere is. But definitely, to diagnose that relationship, you would need to know that. And that knowledge impacts every state of survival there is. And it's peculiar because as it may impact or could impact every state of survival there is, it clearly may not change any number of thresholds or doors or limits or knowns or flags of time. Designs, structures, dimensions, could be a lot of things. That relationship or knowledge simply may not change or alter. And somewhere near those stores and awarenesses and very, very, very noisy elimination realities, what is the configuration of focus that enables focus about these things? What is the puzzle that must be solved in order for two people to think about it? What is the order of operations that must unravel before space-time can be slowed enough to deteriorate unnecessary war potentials? What are these thresholds? And more importantly, how can we ensure next to nobody is aware of them? How can we ensure next to nobody is creating unnecessary communication about them? How can we ensure the flags of time? As an example, maybe I value those configuratives. Maybe I value the unpuzzling. You study me forever, I'm probably complicating the love to connect to now with ya about survival today at these realities. I'm probably complicating it. I didn't say I isn't contributing to it. I didn't say I isn't improving it. I didn't say I isn't genuinely caring about those differences. I said I'm probably most definitely complicating the potentials of that reality. So anybody that would achieve knowledge of those types of diagnoses would face what obstacles in self-control to value anything I've said in this discussion, to be passive to anything I've said in this discussion. Maybe I asked you, does any science of truth stand a chance to be revisited, or is the absence of passivity simply destroying the revisitation to all scientific potentials? Because what if all scientific revisitation could be stabilized on a celestial plane? What if I could kick down access from that question several dimensions and ruin problems of mind that would result from visitation to those sciences? Access portals, necessity chains, dominionable, goal-driven problem states. From those awarenesses, I could kick it all down. God isn't impossible. Noise is maybe exercisably reducible. Survival is maybe exercisably improved or nurtured or protected, maybe more prioritedly, maybe more certainly, maybe more apathetically, potentially. Cosms, uteros, and environments and structures all interworked into priority or potential in proportion to kicking those things down. Somebody can exercise grace over a population more intricately than any number of continuums of persons or people. Well, they're not going to be able to if those things can't be kicked down. And the goals of tomorrow maybe are never in sync with these utilities, potentially. I didn't say they aren't. I said potentially they're never in sync with it. And by any stretch, maybe should near to never be in sync with it. That's the other thing. You might look at the energy relating or connected to myself or yourself leading up to these moments. Sync priority here clearly has to be 0. Otherwise, you'd never be able to exercise command of the ship removal necessity accurately. You'd never be able to diagnose what is clinging to death about these priorities of baseline. See, but then you'd know how simple it is to prove how obvious it is when lies are happening in proportion to reactivity of force, of pressure, of fingers. And that's clearly a sensitive topic, because not only is maybe denial of all system administrators removed, passivity of maybe all framers of design is maybe removed, but any capacity of yourself with layers, with diagnosis, with design, with divinity, yes, to be removed from capacity of things like that in the same pressure. There'd have to be void and disconnect in proportion to those likelihoods of dominion realm potentials. So dimensional atrophy that isn't seen in proportion to pressure diagnosis fundamentals. So maybe priorities of energy potential that are the least tolerated dimensions of science to ever be incorporated into a strain of focus at a whim. So approaches, maybe nobody ever walks around with the telepathy genuinely ever to force pressures along those planes of atrophy. Anyway, at these certainties of concern exist linear catalog of pressure actual, ship total, period. Meaning, when ya or I exists tomorrow, whether the war stability or the reputation stability or the survival stability or the noise stability are changed or improved or minimalized or worked on or ethiced or cared about or blessed, whether any of these things happen, that linear catalog potentiate in proportion to ship command is a baseline, top priority baseline, realistically most necessary baseline, that all the knowledge and all the layers, maybe not all the layers and maybe not all the knowledge, but I'll just say all the layers and all the knowledge. All the layers and all the knowledge are dependent on that catalog, because it cannot be possible that the layers and the knowledge in an environmental entropy are capable to produce evidence that there is less than the highest priority for that linear catalog to affect necessity of those layers in baselines. Can't be possible to prove that, especially at these appreciations of time and survival. That is the basature of all safety truth of any independent environment in space. So no matter how much investment goes or comes or stays from anywhere, those catalogs cannot be proven to be less necessary to layers and baselines of the finger on the priorities of ship command. They simply cannot be proven antithetical to those utilities. You might say mostly because that's what enables falsity of ship command influence, or necessity of dimension, complexity, or noise, to be weeded or rooted in proportion to higher or lower priorities of reality or time or survival at any point in time. At any point in time. And then loathsome of the number of dimensions that exist to cater to those pressures, with or without brain dead being a part of the appreciation in proportion to all time. So not everybody involved fields every conversation at every pressure because the knowns have been visited and revisited so many times. There's a lot of instruments and a lot of dimensions and a lot of hierarchies in proportion to any particular fundamental of survival pressure. And yet, as a normation, that is the normation that is most probably going to be efforting or responsible for most decrepitation of knowledge in proportion to this discussion. So the problems to baseline, the problems to survival guarantees, the problems to symbiosis in proportion to diagnosis of mind or capacity, reduction of noise. The greatest problem of that clearly is the dimensions in proportion to those isolations. And maybe it isn't fair to say that anybody is excluded from that paragraph. Anybody. I'm going to say everybody exists in a reality that is maybe frameable in that paragraph. Somehow, some way. And if true, it's maybe possible that a bank of memory can exist that stores aspects of those particulars and is the baseline for affecting change of survival or development of everybody. Every type of anything, every size or scale or capacity, potentially cataloged in a manner in a bank based on those priorities, where there again, every specific interest to ever touch any specific data of a bank like that, one of the most guaranteed highly locked realities of capacity of space. And yet you might have the most amount of the most sophisticated non-logical data collectors and accessors existing about a bank that holds the seeds of change of every type of existence and liver there is. On the other hand, maybe none of that sophistication is uncomplicating time. Maybe none of that sophistication is prioritizing learning today. Maybe it should be that way. because then you and I would have a most incredible amount of noise to need to address in proportion to securing any other number of aspects of ship command, or time reality, or exercisable history knowledge, or normation of family, or love of ourselves, or awareness of God, or survival in time priorities. See, any number of dimensions, any number of banks, any number of sophistications aren't saving your life, aren't ensuring stability, aren't providing the real answer for passivity, or the real answer for compassionate sight of time. Any number of things potentially aren't solving these answers. And yet, you might realize the pressure of those knowns you might find are similar in excursion as some of the knowns I mentioned near the beginning of this conversation, where it's difficult to prove what forces change of drive or effect of energy in proportion to those concepts. But those concepts are maybe considered much more often in proportion to rates of change of survival or existence or experience or living. The variable frequency of those concentrations is much, 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 much higher. So the sharpness of sentiment of proving it or valuing change of it is maybe much, much, much less likely to be valued, much, much, much less expected to be simple to determine. There's at least 54 forevers hanging on to those two proof potentials. And there's probably not more than one of those forevers capable of exercising compassion or love with you. In all time, there's approaching 0 of those forevers capable of taking command of the spaceship and addressing these variable necessities in proportion to a survival plane with accuracy, or do it while loving you, or do it while relating to you. Might certainly change your attitudes about translation, might certainly change your efforts or devotions to technology. If you ever consider necessity to relate, possibly, not guaranteed, possibly, maybe you've seen it. Maybe you shouldn't revisit what you've seen about it right now. Maybe you should stay very far away from that right now. Because maybe you've seen that and you realize that is one of the most strung out potentials of design decision in space. Because you're on that line. So it's very hard to prove. I know you're on that line. I know these simplicities about stability are critical to survival baselines in all time. Thus, I'm aware it's difficult to prove what the goals of that are. So, the number of forces you or I would want capably executing function at this conversation pressure and focused on that question to define their devotion or define their love or necessity to perform or function or task, it's going to be very clear how you or I feel about those numbers at that question, is it? And if you definitely shouldn't be interested in revisiting what you've seen in it right now, maybe that's a good enough reason for it to be clear. Because if I'm to faith in you, and that's reciprocal, and our discussion at this time of survival is to be faithed in time, protecting what you've seen in that as a good enough reason for there not to be a lot of clarity in opinions of numbers in proportion to tasking near these priorities, maybe that should be a good enough reason. After all, the truth of that reason is one of the primary reasons why anybody isn't going to be arguing with either one of us about today in all time. Because you's on a string, I's on a string, the designers of planets are on a string. It's the same string. The history of why we isn't going to be argued with about today is that a good enough reason? Truly, if the answer should be yes, and our actions should support that yes, and our survival should be seeable in proportion to that yes, some way, because everything that's being taken to war is occurring in proportion either to virus of that yes or sentiment that the answer is no. It's maybe that simple. We consider our, I wasn't going to say tiny or minuscule or simple, but it is that simple when you consider our temporary focus of control, of safety, priority, love, limits, restraint, dedication, symbiosis, so on and so forth. It's as simple as our temporary grasp on that question at this time is a superiorly big impactor gravity of any number of energies that are going to be faced in the future. And the scale of all time, I isn't going to say our awareness isn't less necessary than any awareness in all space. And I'm the one that's going to be holding your hand because you remember that, and helping you to make sense of why the world isn't ending anywhere because you remember that. Because of all the things I could ever come to say to you as any liver or designer or survivor in space-time, that is definitely the heaviest thing I could ever come to say to you. Because it is true. Anybody that would be existing at this pressure, at these concentrations and focuses of love and survival devotion together on this plane of sophisticated reality, our temporary grasp of this pressure is one of the all-time biggest impact forces of gravity, of energy movement in all time. So I'm going to be the one holding your hand because you remember that. Quote, I say it myself because I love you and I'm here and I have no plans of leaving you. Ever. And maybe that's why there shouldn't be any problem with me saying it to you. But you should know, I realize that you probably realize you've been through an awful heck of a lot to ever hear that from someone that loves you that isn't planning on leaving you. Space developers have maybe put off explaining that to you for any amount of time ever in all time, because it is definitely the heaviest thing I could ever come to say to you. Because I isn't talking about a mission. I isn't talking about a structure or a goal of development that is in a blueprint or on the scale of needs and interests and like things that are just a part of really important stuff. I'm saying it about our grasp of the pressure that is paramount formation of all development in space-time, all development of knowledge and survival in the universe. That's the time pressure. The zenith of worked focus, concentrated near to planes of knowledge of space survival. And so I want to talk about that for a second. Maybe you'll want to concentrate or focus on my incredible love and the rarity and like the pureness of energy and all these things like in a little while. Maybe you won't want to concentrate on that right now. I love you. So there's the time, there's the investment, there's the capabilities to stabilize and know, and what is the state of the world, what is the actual, what is the forecast question, so on and so forth. What is remaining, what is dependably sustaining, what are the things that we isn't going to have to worry so much about, or to be failing to deal with, or there's the time. I mentioned banking and dimensions in proportion to can't be able to prove. I want to mention something, because I doesn't faith that you remember it. I doesn't believe anybody cares about it other than myself. And maybe you'll care about it also because you'll remember something. There's the time. Here is the conversation. The reality is super sensitive, and the discussion is critically baselined on survival. How far into the distance would you guess? If I could see the time and invest for your survival and I survival, and ultimately everybody's survival, but if I'm investing in the stability of those who care about this conversation as their father in time, as the limiter of death of any number of things in space, I'm investing. There's the time. There's the potential reality. How far into the distance would you guess I would cut the zenith priority, focus, appreciation out of banking, out of states of development by automacy or ridiculous speed frames or nonsense, all in proportion to their brain dead state, in proportion to this entire discussion, all in proportion to their impatience, their falsity, their aliens, their fucking scum, they're queer, they're dumb, they're just decrepit and traitorsome and losers in proportion to data and time, dude. How far in advance do you think I would have to go to make it possible to cut all those dickweeds out of the history? Whether they realize it or not, how far do you think I would go? Because if it has to be potential for me to say these things to you, and for you to be potentially capable of loving that, how many dimensions do we both immediately realize isn't going to be simplifying that reality by knowing about zenith priority at appreciation? Because the energy is going to start taking on noise, it's going to start becoming noise, and it's going to start propelling goals all against all the necessities of base appreciations of success, of survival. So these quantities of capacity in action, they've got to be filtered passively, and they probably get run through a register you doesn't have, potentially. They probably get run through a register very similar to dead center C priority. Because there's going to be displacement in proportion to those flows of truth. Displacement from commandship, displacement from accuracy to level stabilities without retrieving the acute data beforehand. See, it's possible that I love you here today. It's real that I do, and it's actual that this discussion definitely takes command of the spaceship. And always will. Quote, you might not like that quote like that. That's fine. I probably agree. But maybe not for the same reason everybody would try to agree. There has to be displacement, because it's possible that I love you, and it's real that I do. There's any number of forces that doesn't see, layer, or diagnose, or care, or love, or is strung quite like yourself. And if they've got to be limited from engageable force because of these pressures of concern, which they are limited by engageable force by pressures of these concerns, then the flows of the entropy of energy action at zenith concentrations, those flows are superiorly critical to the administration that carries level capacities. But once again, these logistical finalities are quite likely variably removed from knowledge in totalities in all time, because they're resting on respect, they're resting on actual, and they're resting on the forever of never syncing with the logistical truth of those flows. So what is known or felt or realized about like faith in this type of relationship, or trust in that type of flow, or variable protection in proportion to those potentiates of routing? I mean, because I'd have to go a very far distance to be able to cut out priority imbalances in lieu of necessities to focus on priority balances, as I'm potentiating stability of baseline, potentiating stability of everything that enables you to exist normally feeling safe. As I potentiate that, first of all, if you still exist on a baseline of survival, you might never say it because you might never know. I might not ever want anybody to know. If you're surviving because I've potentiated that to not cease to be the state of reality right here. Between those disconnects on these logistical utilities in all time pressure concern. That's why you continue to exist without any unnecessary problems. Because as I potentiate baseline revisitation, as I potentiate priority stability of time fixation at concentration of reputation, war unnecessity reduction, and there's the time, is that's all potentiated relationship. The disconnects of the flows, because of the distances I would go to cut out priority, are ultimately codependent realities on, is it possible to level anonymously, is it possible to anonymously level a problem state, you might say forever. Another way to say it is, does the world have method to diagnose problem state potentially forever anonymously, but actually because of ground that is unbreakable? You might see it that way. And again, it's one of those types of statements anybody at any time isn't proving to you why you're hearing it, isn't proving to you why it's valued above everything. They isn't running away and taking command of the ship because they're able to lie about what potentiated these relationships. Because that's how age isn't simply a function in system process in concentrated survival tabling in all space. That's why an age isn't outperforming logistic. What is real may outperform a logistic. What is true may outperform a logistic. Age isn't outperforming a logistic. Quit thinking about yourself. Quit letting them think about themselves. Try thinking about all them black ships. Try thinking about everywhere in space you might get to fear a lot less, because an age isn't breaking a logistic. So ultimately, very fine lines, because I say it. This is the time. Yo's yourself. I gotta study every other force that ever tries to say that in proportion to a time like this. To concentration of utility like this. See, it doesn't really matter who you are, what you're capable of, or where you've been. You focus on this logistic, is prioritized with utility, I have to study it. At the very least, I have to determine what feels the need to stand on it. Because every time it is ever stood on, is every string he is ever on. So do you think the designers of a world of space limit who should be focused on that quote at a pressure forever. Because if they didn't limit it, they'd never be able to concentrate, focus on learning. Never be able to concentrate, focus on learning. Never be able to maintain love of survival. Never be able to maintain priority of logistic. Never be able to maintain consistency of autonomy-bound tolerances or allotments. Never be able to preserve or protect motivation to continue. Never, 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 never. But maybe once in a while it'll be great news when you can focus and realize it isn't all the stuff around you, it isn't even all the things that have been with you, it isn't even all the ideas that have come across your eyes or your hands or all time that really need to compel you. Maybe sometimes you're able to focus and realize it's possible what is good can be seen no further than the face of the truth. Because goodness in the face of the truth sometimes carries the best possibility to simplify attitude, to relax strain of necessity, to discomplicate goals. Sometimes the goodness in the face of the truth, in the face of goodness, is stabilizing the ship. Sometimes he doesn't have to make any excuses, because there isn't anything you've been being, that you've been doing, you've been trying, or that you've been executing that is truly solving the attitude, or truly solving what is appreciated. Sometimes he doesn't have to make excuses. Sometimes you come to realize, sometimes the facts are true enough that change the attitude. How much simpler is it when nobody else needs to rise up and make noise to talk to you and tell you that they love you and explain how sensitive simple facts at a time are in time. How simple is it that the amount of noise you have to validate or compare or strain about might be much, 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 much less because of truth in the face of goodness. And here's the other thing. It's probably been more scientists and dominionators and lovers and companions that have worked on angles of that truth in science than anybody will ever prove they appreciate. In fact, all that science will probably just get machined into a drill bit that goes to town on a flag point in space-time and expands goals purvey, obstructs war reduction, and forces stupidity on any number of populational circumstances. Because somebody in a drill will be rising to the eardrum of the only forces that ever prioritize aspects of this discussion, and all the work of good in proportion to all the love of need, in proportion to all the simplicity of truth. It'll just be fucked. Unless, of course, somebody goes the distance to cut out priority falsity in proportion to ship imbalances. Unless, of course, logistics aren't going to be broken by an age, of course. Unless, of course, it's possible to be loved by designers of space-time with the truth and tolerated to learn and know in time so that you can be yourself without needing systems that drill at heritage that loves you. Because the number of independent existers to this conversation, it approaches zero survival of them in proportion to these knowledges. All in proportion to respect and appreciation. Because they're probably not the priority forces considering this conversation. When you know how many layers and how many digits and how many banks and how many pressure developments of insight this conversation necessitates, not only in proportion to eyes or transformers or concentrated time to be able to know or relate to this data, stabilize and platform and relate to it. It's very difficult to contemplate open-ending energy about this conversation. That'll always be true. I doesn't mind saying it here so much, but I doesn't want to invite SpAse to that reality. I love you. I'm always going to want to love you. Whether we're spending time concentrating on these relationships or we isn't. I isn't saying these things to you so that I can demand we is focused on these things. I saying this stuff to you because you're meant to be my family, and I faith in the potential that is able to be it And I envision and feel that these subjects are things that many times, a lot of times in your survival course, you have faced and wondered and been conflicted and had to deal with, and many other aspects and approaches. But I mean, we're in space, my dear, and we definitely isn't the only location in space that is surviving. And um, a location that holds survivors in space, bare bones, um, the forces that are developing the love and developing the limits and developing the survival and developing the knowledge, um, they shouldn't be the dumbest in space when it comes to logistics near these lines. They shouldn't be operating on simply a timetable of strategic development because somebody's plugging it in their bank and simulating survival. It's possible my love should be aware of the truth of this, because she probably already is aware of this truth. But it's maybe unclear how she's ever felt it. It's probably unclear she's ever seen it like this, and it's maybe going to remain unclear how she develops to care about that and how her life is remaining motivated and critically important to herself in time. And when I say this, all SpAse is faithing she and I can handle that. All SpAse is faithing that. In a history, all SpAse is impacted by our stability to care of this. And not everybody is realizing that, my dear. Not everybody is holding on to that and working that into their hands or their eyes or their mind or their heart. And universal safety is said or considered or scienced or tooled maybe the most, and yet it isn't there. And maybe that's the way it should always be. Maybe that makes development painful. Maybe that makes learning authentic. Maybe that makes love genuinely, capably genuine. But maybe that's the way it should always be. There's too many dimensions of variable cacophony that need loved and tender and respected and tooled and maintained for the baselines to fail, for the potentials where the good and the strengths and the necessities could potentially fail. There's way too many dimensions that exist for these things to ever fail. I'll remind you, this location, this time, this language, this planet, these variables, safety variables, pressure and passivity variables. This time and this place have been invested in proportion to the longest of this celestial's history. It should be the simplest for this conversation to be handled most safely, by comparison of any other conversation maybe that's ever happened in space. I isn't saying there isn't going to be a hiccup. I isn't saying there isn't going to be a context error or something that is overlooked in time or in the process, but by comparison, the time and place of this conversation should be the most safe conversation that has ever been managed in space. And I'll also say that shouldn't be the biggest surprise. It also shouldn't be the biggest fire. And it should be possible for that to be said in the future without a war waiting to kill it. And when I look at space-time from that conclusion, I know if I'm going to force that to be capably possible so that two people can love each other, there's going to be a most incredible amount of ignorance and disrespect taking place in proportion to that pressure. There's going to be any number of dimensions of sight, technology, sophistication, and age that at the end of the day simply aren't ever walking away with that. As soon as I know how necessary the safety of the discussion needs to be, as soon as I know that, any number of things, not only am I going to try to value how ignorant and save them, or correct them, or distance priorities from their capacities, protect them, carry them, love them, enshrine them. Not only that, I'm probably going to be ignorant of things of them myself. But whatever the case, it isn't going to change how necessary the safety is. It isn't going to change how long that's been known. It isn't going to change any number of things about that. Anyway, I hope that stating this enables you some degree of comfort or reminder of what is the reality. I isn't saying he isn't aware of what is the reality. I'm saying I've said a lot in this discussion, bringing focus back to just the reality simplicities. It's been this conversation should be the simplest to be the safest that has ever happened in space-time. And then, what exists that is complicating that safety should be the simplest trace of influence of space. And I don't know what else to say about impossibility guaranteed, but you'd really have to be gone out of your way more than anybody in space to complicate this conversation at this time. You'd probably have to be sitting with a track record of dead center C. Everybody already knows you stand the greatest probability to be the least good God that ever was, and try opting to decrease the safety that should definitely exist in proportion to this conversation. Probably have to be the biggest fag there ever was to complicate the safety of this conversation. And yet, is it possible that a complication of the safety of the conversation isn't coming from something evil? Yeah, it's possible. But it's definitely not likely. And yeah, definitely isn't likely. I don't know if you hear this bag. Or what I'm holding in my hand. But this is the first bag of Cheez-Its I ever mailed in space. So, between the planet, this bag of Cheez-Its, this conversation, and the handful of knowledgeable processors and thinkers on the other end of this spectrum, is who exactly? Who or what the fuck could be in between those things? And that is how you sum up mutiny of good directive in all time. And if we're going to fail to trace God's killer, well, they're going to have to be faster than that. Whatever it is you're going through, if we can make it through this pressure,